Good evening, everyone. My name is Dan Snidacker. I'm the chair of the adult education programs at the Touro Synagogue Foundation. And that committee is a wonderful committee, some wonderful people in it. Shirley Saunders, Donna Padrat, Sam Shamoon, Emily Colbert Cairns. Want to thank them for everything they've done to help this season get going. And I'd also like to thank Keith Stokes, who's chair of the middle school programs at the foundation. I'd like to thank Meryl Cawley, who's the driving force behind everything that goes on at the foundation. I'd like to thank Ann Arnold, who's the PR promotional whiz, has gotten us great exposure. So for all those people and everybody else, thank you very much for your help. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the winter 2022-2023 season of the Judah Touro program series of the Touro Synagogue Foundation. This series of diverse programs seeks to connect the history of the synagogue to the important themes in American history, to develop a more relevant and sophisticated voice for that history, and to bring it to as wide and inclusive an audience as possible. And Zoom really helps us do that. True to that mission, this season, we begin with a presentation that addresses one of the most compelling and difficult issues in the history of Touro, and in fact, the entire Atlantic world: Jews, slavery, and the meaning of freedom. After tonight's presentation, we'll turn to Amsterdam, that Dutch city that became an epicenter for a new version of Western Sephardic, or Spanish and Portuguese, Jewish culture, architecture, and religious practice, all of which strongly influenced Newport's first Jewish settlers. Our talk on January 12th, 2023 at noon, direct from Utrecht in the Netherlands, with Peter Vleerdingerbroek, will explore the architecture of, in a sense, the mothership of this Western Sephardic tradition, the 1675 Portuguese synagogue there in Amsterdam, the Esnoga, a building with a very direct influence on the architecture of the 1763 Touro synagogue. On February 9th, 2023 at 6 p.m., Samantha Baskin, distinguished professor of art and history at Cleveland State University, will present a wonderful illustrated talk titled "Picturing Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews in 17th and 18th century Amsterdam," using the work of artists such as Rembrandt and Picard and others who were all very interested in the Jewish population there and drew them and made those drawings into etchings. And that'll be a very interesting way of looking at the kind of the culture of Sephardic Jewry at that point. On March 30th, 2023 at noon, we will close this season's programs and return to Newport for a collaborative presentation hosted by the Rhode Island School of Design Museum and their ongoing program titled "Local Collections and Conversations." It's a great initiative on their part. It will feature Touro Synagogue's Ner Tamid, the eternal light that hangs in front of the ark, and the great chandelier, which is kind of immediately behind that, along with comparable objects from the collection of the RISD Museum. And it should be a really very interesting afternoon. Presenters will include Howard Newman, nationally respected Newport artist and conservator who restored both those objects for the synagogue. Without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Paul Finkelman, who's the Rydell Visiting Professor at Gustavus Adolphus College in Minneapolis and a research affiliate at the Max and Tessie Zelikowitz Center for Jewish Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago, a great program, and his BA from Syracuse University, another great program. Right after that, he was a fellow in law and humanities at the Harvard Law School. He is a nationally known scholar and the author of more than 50 books and 200 scholarly articles And the United States Supreme Court has cited his scholarship in 6 different opinions. His most recent major book was Supreme Injustice: Slavery in the Nation's Highest Court, published by Harvard University Press in 2018. He's published op-eds and essays in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, the USA Today, the Huffington Post, and many others. He has held fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Library of Congress, and he's held a Fulbright Chair in Social Justice and Human Rights at the University of Ottawa. You can see his impressive career in full by visiting the Wikipedia page linked to his name. Just Google his name and the Wikipedia page will come up. Dr. Finkelman will address a central paradox of the founding of America, the intermingling of the noble ideals of liberty and freedom with the poison of slavery and racism. In a terrible irony, the history of Newport, a city founded upon the principles of religious liberty, that history is also about those who could not live freely here, enslaved Africans. Many Newport residents, including Jews, owned slaves and participated in some aspect of the transatlantic system. That system of colonial commerce throughout the Atlantic basin relied on the slave trade and goods produced through the labor of enslaved Africans. So slavery was key to that whole Atlantic system. And it is now a topic of considerable importance to us all as we try to address the issue of the legacy of slavery and the continuing poison of racism. We have a responsibility at the Touro Synagogue Foundation to be forthright and honest about all of this and to get the story straight. Paul Finkelman is one of the best at doing this and at putting these issues in a broad framework that helps us meet that responsibility. We are honored to have him as our first presenter this season. And here then is Professor Finkelman. Thank you very much. Paul.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here in Rhode Island by way of Zoom. I should point out that Gustavus Adolphus is actually in St. Peter, Minnesota, and I wouldn't want the college to think that somebody had moved it. But I am moving back and forth these days between St. Peter, Minnesota, and Albany, New York, where I'm actually at the moment. I also just need to note that I see a couple of old friends on this program, including the Burstons and Greg Castor, and I'm delighted to see friends from a long time ago who've suddenly found me. So here I am. So every year, Jews hold a Seder, and we say that we were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord our God took us out of there with a strong hand and with an outstretched arm. And with these words, we celebrate the Passover holiday, and we have a Seder, and we talk about freedom. And the Exodus story is the central moment, I would argue, of Judaism and the creation of the Jewish faith. In the United States, for example, there are many holidays that celebrate various things. We even now have a new holiday for Juneteenth, celebrating the last end of slavery by the United States Army when it reached Texas. But as far as I know, there is no other religious faith that has a holiday that celebrates the end of slavery. And because of the centrality of the Exodus to Judaism and the Jews leaving Egypt, one would imagine the Jews and Judaism were inherently anti-slavery. Unfortunately, as we'll discuss today, it's far more complicated than that. The first piece of the complication is this, that slavery has been present in virtually every known human society. Everywhere in the world, there has been slavery. The only place, in fact, where scholars have not found slavery have been among the Inuit or sometimes called the Eskimo peoples of the Arctic Circle and the Aboriginals of Australia. And in both cases, it is because the climates were so harsh and the food sources so scarce that slavery was not something that would have made any sense to people. But otherwise, we find slavery everywhere. We find slavery all over Africa. We find slavery all over Asia. We find slavery in Europe. We find slavery in the Americas before the arrival of Europeans. If people think that Europeans brought slavery to the New World, as the Europeans called it, it wasn't new to the people who lived there. They should read about the Aztecs and the Inca and the Maya and the Iroquois and the Haida in what is today Washington and Oregon and British Columbia. There are slave traders everywhere. Why is there slavery? Because slavery makes it easier for the people who own slaves to have better lives. The great Harvard sociologist Orlando Patterson observed in a very important study of slavery called Slavery and Social Death. There is nothing notably peculiar about the institution of slavery. It has existed before the dawn of human history, right down to the 20th century, in the most primitive of human societies and the most civilized. Patterson found slavery in every region on earth and concluded there's probably no group of people whose ancestors were not at one time slaves or slaveholders. And I would argue that there probably is no group of people whose ancestors were not both slaves and slaveholders at some time in their history. Slavery differs from place to place. In some places, it is less obviously brutal than others. Slaves have different rights in different places. For example, in Rome, a slave could own private property. Slaves could even become professionals. There were doctors who were slaves. There were well, they didn't have colleges, but they were the equivalent of higher education teachers who were slaves. At the same time, a Roman slave owner could kill his slave for any reason or no reason at all, and this was not considered a crime. On the other hand, in the United States, with the exception of Louisiana, a slave owned nothing. The clothing on their back belonged to the owner. And yet, by the 1820s, every U.S. southern state had made the premeditated murder of a slave a murder punishable by death, and there are at least a couple of examples of masters either being executed for murdering their slaves or being sent to prison for doing so. And there are examples of other whites being executed for murdering slaves. So slavery varies from place to place. But what is clear is that the fundamental aspect of slavery is always the same. As Aristotle put it, a slave is one who belongs by nature not to himself but to another and is by nature a slave. And a person is a human being belonging to another is an article of property. So forever there was slavery. And so when we think about the Bible, when we think about Jewish history, when we think about early Christianity, we need to understand that all of these cultures develop in a world where slavery is accepted, normal, common, and predictable. Moreover, and this is, of course, what makes non-US or non-Western Hemisphere post-European arrival slavery different from slavery everywhere else in the history of the world, is that slavery was never racial. It was not even ethnic. Anyone was enslavable. Anyone could be a slave owner. And it was indeed quite plausible, at least in theory, that someone could be a slave owner, a slave, and then later again a slave owner in one's lifetime. To use a kind of simple example of this, one could imagine a Roman soldier going into battle, capturing enemies. And in those days, you would kill your enemy on the battlefield, or you would offer the enemy the right to become your slave, and then the enemy would not be killed because the person was now your slave. So A Roman soldier could capture a slave, bring the slave home, and now has a slave. Roman soldier goes back into battle, and now this soldier gets captured by the enemy, and he becomes a slave. His family perhaps buys him out of slavery, and now he comes back and is once again a slave owner. So slave owning is something that the entire world seems to be involved in. Indeed, the very word slave is interesting because the word slave comes from the word Slav. And the reason why it comes from the word Slav is because after the collapse of the Roman Empire, the main source of slaves in the Mediterranean region was the Slavic regions of Europe. What is today Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, Russia. And the main slave traders were the Norsemen, or the Vikings, as they're sometimes called, who would capture people in what is today, say, Poland or Lithuania, or into the Ukraine, and bring them by ship to the Mediterranean and sell them to people in what is today Rome or Greece. So if we could get in a time machine and go back and saw a group of blonde men and women being whipped in public and working very hard, and we'd say, who are those people? The Romans or the Greeks or the people in Marseille or the people in Spain or the people in Athens, would say, oh, they're Slavs. And the word Slav became interchangeable with slave to the point where the word became slave in Spanish, in Italian, in French, and in English. By the way, in Latin, the word for slave was servus, which means a servant. And the Romans had no linguistic distinction between somebody who might be a free person who worked for you as a servant and somebody who was your slave. Slavery is acceptable everywhere. It is common. All of the churches of the medieval era, the Renaissance era, the Reformation accept slavery. The Roman Church accepts slavery. And in fact, the Roman Church provides in many ways for people to be enslaved if they violate Catholic doctrine, or they are the victims of a violation of Catholic doctrine. So there is a rule set out in which if a Catholic priest married, which was against his rules, but sometimes they did, and the church found out about it, the wife of the priest and the children of the priest could be sold into slavery, but not in fact the priest himself. He would simply be reprimanded for violating his vows of chastity. This is the world as it existed. And so when Jews are kicked out of Spain and Portugal starting in the 1490s, and they move to Holland and to the Western Hemisphere, they are leaving a world where slavery is common, where people own slaves, and where in fact Jews, as well as Christians and Muslims, had all been owners of slaves. And in fact, could also be enslaved. So slavery is universal, and that is very important for us to understand when we begin to think about the ending of slavery eventually in what becomes the United States and in the Western world. Slavery is endemic, it's common, it's everywhere. And so it is until the American Revolution. And it is during the American Revolution that for the first time in the history of the world, some societies begin to say that it is time for us to end slavery. And so the first two places, as far as I know, anywhere in the world where government said we are going to get rid of slavery are Massachusetts in 1780 and Pennsylvania in 1780. Massachusetts simply writes into its constitution, all men are born free and equal, and everybody understands that means if you're born free and equal, you can't be a slave. By 1783, no one is legally held in slavery in Massachusetts, and by 1790, the census doesn't find anybody who's being held as a slave. Pennsylvania, which has more slaves, develops a different approach. It creates something called a Gradual Abolition Act, And the Gradual Abolition Act says that the children of all slave women will be born free. And as a result of that, slavery will literally die out when there are no more slaves. In 1784, both Rhode Island and Connecticut become the third and fourth jurisdictions in the world to end slavery, along with Rhode Island, which is in the top 5 as well. So this is something that we need to understand. And yet slavery continues well into the 19th century. It continues in Cuba and Brazil into the 1880s. And at the Berlin Conference in 1884 and the Berlin Act of 1885, European nations come together and say, we will no longer accept slavery. And 5 years later, in 1890, the Brussels Act becomes the first comprehensive multilateral treaty specifically directed at ending what was then known as the African slave trade. The League of Nations in the 1920s banned slavery with the Slavery Convention of 1926, and gradually slavery ends in a number of places in the 1920s, such as Burma and Nepal, which still had slavery. And the world sort of could breathe a sigh of relief. Aha, slavery is over. Except, of course, we know that in the 1930s, slavery will reemerge in the Soviet Gulag, in the Japanese Empire, and most prominently in Germany, where approximately 12 million people who were not incarcerated because they were Jewish, but in fact were European Christians, were brought to Germany as forced slave laborers during World War II to work in German factories. This is in addition to hundreds of thousands, if not a million Jews who are enslaved by the Nazis in camps outside Germany or in concentration camps in Germany, but they're not part of this 12 million. And indeed, in 1942, Germany has more people held as slaves than had been held in all of the New World in 1860. And of course, it's important to understand that the United Nations demands an end to slavery in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and subsequent documents. At Nuremberg, people are hanged for enslavement. It is a capital offense. And gradually the world seems once again to be ending slavery, so that in 2012, Mauritania, the last place in Africa where slavery is legal, finally says we will end slavery. Saudi Arabia does not end it until the 1960s. And again, the world thinks slavery is over. But weirdly, in 2018, ISIS, which proclaimed to have its own government, declared that it was going to reintroduce slavery and authorize the enslavement of people, the buying and selling of people. So that's kind of a general history of slavery. And it is important to understand this. And it is important to understand the universality of who could be a slave. As Moses Finley, the great historian of the ancient world, wrote, there were Greek slaves in Greece and Italian slaves in Rome. And there were Chinese slaves in China, Russian slaves in Russia, Muslim slaves in all Islamic societies, and there were Jewish slaves in ancient Israel. And indeed, if we think about the Bible, we begin to understand how slavery is rooted in the ancient world. Think of the story of Abraham. Abraham is married to Sarah, who is unable to bear children. And so instead he has a child with Hagar, his slave. And this is very common in almost all slave societies. Men would have children with their slaves, and the slaves would be, the children of these slave women would be raised as the legitimate heirs of the father. But Sarah, of course, is angry at Hagar because Hagar has given Abraham an heir and she is not. She mistreats Hagar. Hagar runs away. And according to the biblical story, an angel from God goes back to Hagar and says, go back to your mistress, go back and be a slave, and I will make your son into a great nation. By the way, just to understand all of these connections, in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, when people in the North, particularly in New England, objected to the fugitive slave laws, objected to the return of runaway slaves who went from Virginia or Louisiana or Georgia to the North, Southerners would pick up their Bible and say, if it's good enough for God to send an angel to return Abraham's runaway slave, then what right do you people who, and they would of course be referring to fellow Christians because it is an overwhelmingly Protestant world. What right do you fellow Protestant Christians have to think that you are better than Abraham or than God? You should return our fugitive slaves. And of course, we know that Jacob has two wives, but according to the biblical story, he has children with Bilhah and Zilpah, who are his slaves. And so, in fact, if one wants to think about Jews as a people, all Jews are in some way or other descendant of the children of two slaves owned by Jacob. And that's laid out in the Bible. The story of Joseph underscores this. Joseph is hated by his brothers. They can't stand him. He's the favored son of his father. And so what does his brothers do? They tie him up, they beat him up, they take his coat of many colors away from him, and they sell him to the Ishmaelites. And the Ishmaelites take him to Egypt. And no one doubts that it's okay for Joseph to be a slave, because the Ishmaelites find this guy dirty and in torn clothing and beaten up by these other men, all older than Joseph, who clearly have control over him. They say, he's our slave, we're selling him to you. They take him to Egypt. He becomes a slave. So we shouldn't be surprised that slavery is embedded in biblical culture. So the Ten Commandments begins with the first commandment for Jews, which is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of that house of slavery or that house of bondage, depending on how you translate it. And this, of course, is the first commandment for Jews. It is not the first commandment for Protestants. And Catholics fold this verse into their very large first commandment. By the way, just so you all know, Catholics, Protestants, and Jews all have different 10 commandments. And if you go to Exodus 20, you're not going to see, and God gave 10 commandments, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You just see a bunch of verses, and different religions have organized them and numbered them in different ways. But the point is that for Jews, the first commandment is that God has freed you from slavery. But does that make these Jews who have just left Egyptian bondage abolitionists? Does it make God, who is giving the Jews the 10 commandments, an abolitionist? Well, not really, because when you get to the commandment on the Sabbath says that you should rest on the Sabbath. And not only should you rest, but your slaves should be rested. You can't make your slaves work on the Sabbath. And the 10th commandment says you can't covet your neighbor's wife, but you also can't covet your neighbor's male slave and female slave. So there's an expectation that you will have slaves. And in case you missed it in Exodus 20 for the 10 commandments, you go to Exodus 21, and it has a whole set of rules about how you can enslave people, including how you can legitimately sell your daughter into slavery. And of course, some people will say, well, that's not really slavery, it's something else. If you're selling somebody as a property to someone else, and that person has control over that person, it is a slave. Now, it is true that the the Jewish Bible has some profoundly important laws to protect in some ways the humanity of slaves. So, for example, it is a crime in Jewish law to murder your slave, just as it was in the American South. But the law also says that if a slave is beaten and dies a few days later after the punishment, the master is not guilty of punishing the slave because, as the Bible says, he is his money. That is to say, the slave is the money, the property of the slave owner. And no one would imagine that the slave owner would kill a slave on purpose. So it's an accidental death, and therefore it is not a crime. So these are the complexities of slavery. Later in Leviticus, there's a bunch of provisions on how you treat slaves who are not Jewish, foreigners. And it says that moreover, of the children of the strangers that sojourn among you, you may buy them and their families that are with you, and you may make them an inheritance for your children after you to hold for possession. Now, the point here is not to say, oh, isn't it horrible that the ancient Jews accepted slavery, but rather to simply point out that the ancient Jews weren't very much different in terms of the acceptance of the institution of slavery than everybody else in the known world at that time. They are different in the sense that they declare that slavery, murdering your slave, would be a capital offense, and they are different in the sense that they say that if you maim your slave on purpose, that you will have to free that person. That makes it a somewhat less awful kind of slavery than other bondage, but it is still slavery. And so now let's move forward, if we may, to the settlement of the New World. So Jews who come to the early New World are escaping a ruthless expulsion from Spain and a similar expulsion from Portugal a few years later. They are leaving a culture which has slavery everywhere. They are part of a culture which has slavery. And they move to a new world where, again, slavery is brought into the political and economic system almost immediately. Why? Because slaves are cheap labor that can do the awful work necessary to grow the first great product of the New World drug trade, which is sugar. Europeans are addicted to sugar. They can't get enough sugar. They can't grow it in Europe. And so sugar expansion enriches Spain, ultimately enriches England, enriches France. The more sugar you grow, the more money you make. The more sugar the Portuguese grow in Brazil, the more money the Portuguese make. Sugar is a horrible product to grow. It requires vast labor. It's grown in climates that are full of disease and bugs and snakes and other unpleasant things. And so it's much nicer to have your sugar grown by slaves. And so as Jews move to the Caribbean, they are caught up they are part of a society, just like any other society in this world that has slaves. Now, what's fascinating is that with the exception of Suriname, which is, of course, a very small country, a Dutch colony north of Brazil, there are almost no Jews involved in plantation agriculture in the New World. There are a few Jewish planters in Barbados, In the United States, there is one famous Jewish plantation owner, Judah P. Benjamin, who was a U.S. Senator and later the Secretary of State for the Confederacy. He owns a sugar plantation in Louisiana because to be a successful politician in Louisiana, he has to be able to say, well, I'm also a planter. So he buys a plantation with a bunch of slaves. He doesn't live there. He's got too much good sense for that. He lives in New Orleans and has a good time, but he owns a plantation. But by and large, what we discover is that while Jews buy slaves in small numbers, they are not likely to own anything like the huge amounts of slaves of their prosperous Christian neighbors, because very few Jews are involved in agriculture. Jews are mostly urban in the New World, whether it is in Barbados and Jamaica, or whether it is later in New York, Philadelphia, and certainly Newport, Rhode Island. And so they become the owners of small numbers of slaves who are very useful for an urban environment. Think of running your house without electricity, without indoor plumbing, without refrigeration, without even regular garbage collection, without running water. Everything has to be bought daily or every other day. You go to the market every day. If you want to cook something, you have to start the fire in the stove. If you want to keep warm in the winter, you have to run the fireplaces. And so the early America is an incredibly labor-intense world. And slave labor in the colonial period, with the exception of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, which have very few slaves for a variety of cultural reasons, most urban places have a significant number of slaves being used as either urban workers or more likely being used as urban household workers. Are they slaves? Yes. Can they be bought and sold? Yes. And let me just say one thing about buying and selling slaves. When you sell a slave, you take that person away from the person's family. You sell a man who no longer will ever see his wife or children again. You sell a child who will never see his or her parents again. You sell a woman who will never see her husband again, or perhaps her children. Sale of a slave, in many ways, is the most cruel aspect of slavery because it destroys human beings' lives. It destroys their personal lives. It undermines their most intimate relations with families. Is slavery brutal? Yeah, people get beaten. But I got to tell you, in the 16th, 17th, and well into the 18th and 19th century, lots of people got beaten. Whipping was a punishment for crime for whites and blacks and anybody else. Masters of servants who were not slaves but free servants beat their servants. Apprentices were beaten by the master craftsman who was teaching them. It is a cold, cruel world. It is not until the 1830s when the Navy finally bans flogging of sailors by captains of ships. And by the way, the flogging of sailors is stopped because of an incessant campaign of one of the highest ranking naval officers who is Jewish, Uriah Phillips Levy. And he is the man who condemns flogging, says we've got to get rid of it. But otherwise, if you think about it, until the 1830s, it's perfectly okay to flog a sailor on a U.S. naval ship. This is a cold, cruel world. But flogging is not the same as selling your wife away, selling your child away, selling you away from your family. So this is urban slavery, and Jews participate in it just as their neighbors do. One way to think about this is that the early Jewish settlers in the New World, while they have a different faith, and they are ethnically different because they're coming mostly from Iberia, even if they're coming from Iberia by way of Holland or England or somewhere else, And a few of them are actually coming from further away. So, for example, the famous revolutionary patriot and member of the Sons of Liberty, Chaim Solomon, comes from Poland to the New World. But by and large, they are ethnically different, they are religiously different, but otherwise, they are in the same economic milieu, the same cultural milieu as their neighbors, and they behave pretty much the same. Now, let me turn to the slave trade, because it's important for Newport, and it is important for understanding the world we are talking about. How do slaves get to the New World? On ships. They are brought here by slave traders. Slave traders go to Africa. They buy slaves. And by the way, just so we understand how universally demoralizing slavery becomes, they are buying slaves from other Africans. Europeans don't go into Africa and capture slaves. You'll sometimes see movies. I mean, the last place you should ever look for history is Hollywood, because they always get it wrong. But they don't go onto the mainland of Africa to capture slaves. They, in fact, rent forts, usually in the harbors of African cities, from local African governments. And the slaves are brought to the forts, or they go to the mainland just into a small area to buy slaves that are brought to them. So Europeans buy slaves. And by the way, whenever I say this, somebody says, well, what does it say about Africans that they would sell other Africans into slavery? And I always say, what does it say about Europeans that they would send 6 million of their neighbors to gas chambers? What does it say about Serbs, Croatians, and Bosnians that they would slaughter each other in the 1990s? There's nothing that says because you are from the same continent that you see people as you, because you always see people as the other, and you can do horrible things to the other. And we should never doubt for a moment. What does it say today about Slavs in Russia and Ukraine? Human beings are not always very nice people. And so the African slave trade begins on the coast of Africa, and it ends up in the New World with literally about 12.5 to 13 million slaves being brought from Africa to the New World between the 1490s and the late 19th century. It actually probably backs up to the 1450s, because there's a small trade of Africans from Africa to the Mediterranean and into Spain and Portugal before Columbus goes to the Western Hemisphere. So this is the slave trade. Initially, the trade is dominated by Spain. By the 1700s, it is dominated by the British. The British become the largest slave traders in the world. And most of the slaves coming from Africa, do not end up in what is the United States. Only about 5% of the entire trade ends up in what becomes the United States. The rest goes to the Caribbean. The largest number go to Brazil, and then to the Caribbean, and then to Venezuela, Colombia, and the smallest number, as I say, goes to what becomes the United States. The overwhelming number of slaves brought to what becomes the United States are not brought by Rhode Islanders. They are not brought by people from Connecticut or New York. They are brought by the British, and the British control the slave trade because it is the engine of the British economy. It is what makes the British economy grow and makes England the most prosperous place in the world in the 18th century. Because the millions of slaves they're bringing to the New World, first of all, brings vast profits to the investors in England. And then the sugar that they produce bring even more profits. And people in England who make manufactured goods are selling them to these plantation owners, mostly in the Caribbean. For France, it's Haiti, which is perhaps the most valuable colony per acre, at least in the New World. There is a small slave trade carried on in Rhode Island. Some of it involves Rhode Islanders going to Africa. Most of it involves Rhode Islanders actually going to the Caribbean and buying slaves that have already been brought in by the British, and they're taking them up north. Rhode Island has a small Black population. It's about 6% in 1708. It grows to about 11.5% in 1755, most of whom are slaves. By 1775, by the Revolution, it's dropped down to 6% again. And by the way, that's the largest percent of any of the New England colonies. The second largest is Connecticut, but significantly, both Rhode Island and Connecticut begin to end African slavery after the Revolution. In this mix are some famous Jewish merchants, one of whom is, of course, Aaron Lopez and his father-in-law, Rodriguez Rivera. And they probably bring 3,000, maybe slightly more, slaves into Rhode Island and into the American South before the American Revolution. There are at least 4 other Jewish men who are investing in slaves in this period, or in slave ventures in this period. But what we do know, and we do know this from intensive research on slave trading. And what's fascinating is, why can we do this intensive research on slave trading? Because every time a slave landed in the New World, it was a taxable event for the British government. And so the British government kept meticulous records of how many slaves left Africa and how many slaves landed in the New World, because they could tax each one that lands. So we know who owned the ships, we know who invested the ships. And what we discover is that by and large, while Jewish businessmen invest in slave trading, and by the way, usually it's not a single slave trader, because the slave trading is very risky. If the ship goes down, you lose everything. If there's a revolt on the ship, you may lose your slaves and your sailors. So nobody wants to cough up all the money for a slave trading venture. So you get a consortium of people. You might get 20 investors to each put in 5%. You might get 100 investors putting various amounts from less than 1% to more than 1% into the trade operation. If the trade is successful, everybody makes a fortune, or at least a fortune based on their amount of their investment. And if it's a failure, you didn't lose all that much. But what we do find is that Jews are actually less likely to invest in slave trading ventures than other men who are involved in commerce. And they are much less in London. Jews are much less likely to invest in slave trading ventures than similarly situated English investors in businesses of this kind. But everybody's involved in slavery. The Reverend George Whitefield, who is the famous Anglican preacher of the Great Awakening, believed that you should convert slaves to save their souls. But he found biblical support for slavery and had no problem owning a plantation with 75 slaves in Georgia. We think of Quakers as being anti-slavery, but until the eve of the Revolution, most Quakers were slave owners, and there were Quakers who were involved in the slave trade, just as there are other Protestants in the New World involved in the slave trade. So let me move very quickly, because I see I'm beginning to run out of time, and I'm sure there are many questions. During the Revolution, slavery begins to collapse in the North. The first anti-slavery society in the world is founded in Philadelphia in 1775. Not a good year to start a social venture. And in fact, the society disbands after 4 meetings because the revolution starts. But after the revolution, it comes back into play. A similar society is founded in New York. All of these societies are essentially social, political / religious. Almost all of the leaders are Christian, either Quaker in Pennsylvania or Anglican and Presbyterian in the New York Society. But oddly, there are a few scattered Jews who are able to join these societies and do join these societies. And gradually the North eliminates slavery, mostly through gradual abolition acts, although New York is an interesting example. It passes a gradual abolition act in 1799 saying the children of all slaves will be born free. And then in 1827, it simply says all slaves in the state are now immediately free. We find in Rhode Island, in Newport, in New York, in Philadelphia, Jewish slave owners in all of these cities, slightly less than the average percentage of slave owning for people of the same upper middle class or middle class status of their Christian neighbors, but certainly owning slaves because they need the laborers. On the other hand, we find in, say, Philadelphia's congregation Mikveh Israel that Mordecai, parents obviously aren't very creative about naming people, Jonas Phillips, Moses Myers, and Isaac Myers not only free their own slaves, but are influential in getting their fellow Mikveh Israel members to free their slaves. We find that Moses Judah, a leader of Shereth Israel in New York, not only joins the New York Manumission Society, but serves as a leader and serves on numerous committees. In Philadelphia, Benjamin Nonez, who had owned slaves most of his life, frees them and joins the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. But it's a gradual process. Benjamin Franklin is the president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society in the 1780s. But in the 1770s, he owned slaves just like most of his neighbors did. In the South, Jews owned slaves in cities at about the same rate as their Christian neighbors. Jews are members of the community. They are part of the community. The community owns slaves, and the Jews own slaves. We don't find Jewish abolitionists in the South, although we do occasionally find Jews who move north. And perhaps they're moving north for reasons that have to do with slavery. Just as, for example, Abraham Lincoln's father, who lives in Kentucky, leaves Kentucky with his young son Abe and moves to Indiana because he does not want to live in a slave state. As we move towards the Civil War, we see again a split. In the South, Jews are well integrated into the society. The first U.S. senators who are Jewish come from Florida and then Louisiana. David Levy Yulee from Florida, Judah P. Benjamin from Louisiana. They are both slave owners. In Alabama, there's a congressman named Philip Phillips, who, by the way, had attended synagogue with Benjamin when they both grew up in Charleston. Phillips is a slave owner. He's a congressman. But after he leaves Congress, he does not return back to Alabama, and he tries to remain loyal to the United States during the Civil War. But eventually he's forced back to the South because while he is loyal, his Jewish wife from Charleston is a rabid secessionist, and so he has to leave and go to the South because of that. Most rabbis duck the issue until the 1850s. And in the 1850s, you begin to get a split within the American Jewish community between rabbis who support slavery and rabbis who oppose slavery. Interestingly, the most important supporter of slavery in the rabbinical world is a rabbi from New York City who argues that the Bible supports slavery and therefore it is okay to own slaves. And he is denounced by David Einhorn, who is a recent rabbi who's come from Germany, and he denounces pro-slavery Jewish thought and said, this is not what the Torah is all about. And one of the results of Einhorn speaking out is that he is actually forced to leave Baltimore, where he has a pulpit, and he goes to Philadelphia, where he becomes the rabbi of what is today the sixth oldest Reform synagogue in the country, Knesset Israel. So these are complications. What else we see is that the Jewish community changes starting in the 1840s with a flood of Central European Jews from Germany, from Czechoslovakia, from Hungary, fleeing the revolutions, the failed revolutions of the 1840s, moving to the United States. Many of them become anti-slavery. To my great surprise, when I started doing this research, I discovered that when John Brown is leading an anti-slavery army in Kansas, the crazy John Brown abolitionist, two of his soldiers are Jewish immigrants from Central Europe. And one of them stays in Kansas and ultimately is elected to political office after the Civil War. In Kentucky, a Jewish immigrant named Louis Dembitz becomes one of the few anti-slavery advocates in Kentucky. He is a delegate to the 1860 Republican Convention. In those days, the Republicans, of course, are the party of anti-slavery and the party of racial equality. Louis Dembitz is, some of you may have figured out the name. He is the uncle of a more prominent Jew, Louis Dembitz Brandeis, who will go to the Supreme Court. So this is the changing nature of the culture. During the Civil War, Jews in the South fight for the South. Benjamin serves in Davis's cabinet. Yulee serves in the Confederate legislature, and Jewish Northerners fight for the United States. Frederick Solomon, Frederick Neffler, Edward Solomon, and Leopold Blumenberg become the first Jewish generals, as far as I can tell, in any Western army in the history of the world. There are Jewish companies, and when the Civil War begins, the law says that every regiment should have a Protestant minister as a chaplain, and a regiment in Pennsylvania, organized by a Jewish colonel, chooses a rabbi as a chaplain. Some overly officious Protestant minister, probably hoping he'd get the job, complains to Congress. This violates the law, and the result is the law changes. So one of the aspects of the war against slavery is that it leads to the emancipation of Jews in the military in this way. So I want to stop here only because I think it's, I want to leave time for some questions. So if I can turn to our host, I'm sure you have questions in the chat box for me.
I do. Thank you very much, Paul. This was just amazing. So I went to graduate school at Johns Hopkins University, which had a program in Atlantic culture and history, and did work with people that studied the slave trade and studied slavery. And your 45 minutes here gives as good and concise an overview of that as I've ever heard, quite frankly. So here are a couple of the questions that have come up. Someone asked, does the Bible say free your slaves in 7 years?
Okay, so this is an incredibly complicated question. There is biblical language about a year of Jubilee, about freeing people after 7 years. I have spoken to many Bible scholars who know much more about this than I do, and I cannot get anyone to say that they think this ever happened. Okay. And it is not clear how it happened. There are some indications that perhaps if you enslaved a fellow Jew, you had an obligation to free that person after 7 years. But the book of Exodus, which sets this out, also says that if you enslave a fellow Jew and you give the Jew a wife, or you give a Jewish woman a husband, and when it's time for them to be free, they say, well, I don't want to leave my spouse, then you can enslave them for life so that they can stay with their spouse. So a smart slave owner just figures out how to literally seduce somebody into lifetime slavery.
Right. The whole situation is very complicated, to be sure. For the question for the culture today is how does this relate to anti-Semitism? You know, how does Jews' involvement in slavery and the slave trade get picked up by the anti-Semite?
Well, let me say that if you're interested in facts, as opposed perhaps to what one recent political person called alternative facts, you would discover that the Jewish participation in American slavery and in the African slave trade is so small that had there been no Jews involved, we wouldn't notice the difference. So to say, well, Jews were slave traders, yeah, there are a few who are. In the American South, there are hundreds of white Christians who buy and sell slaves and transport literally millions of them from the East Coast, from Virginia, from Maryland, from North Carolina, from South Carolina, to Louisiana, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi. We have been able to identify 4 or 5 of them who are Jewish businessmen, and they are not major players. Similarly, Aaron Lopez makes a lot of money bringing slaves into Rhode Island. He brings 3,000. That I'm not a good mathematician. I'll let somebody else do the math. What percentage of 12.5 million people is 3,000? It's not even a drop in the bucket. So the question is, why do people say the Jews are responsible for the slave trade? And of course, the main source for this is a book written by the Nation of Islam called The Secret History of the Jews and the Negroes. And in this book, they make the argument that Jews are responsible for the slave trade. It's a fascinating book to look at because it's an example of how you can take an obscure fact, what I call a factoid, and turn it into the whole picture. I'll give you one simple example. In 1831, there is a slave rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia, known as Nat Turner's Rebellion. It's the largest slave rebellion in the United States. It is very bloody. Close to 100 white people are killed. In the end, at least 200 slaves, maybe more, are killed. The rebellion is put down. The militia, the Army, the North Carolina militia, the U.S. Navy are all involved in putting down the Nat Turner Rebellion. If you go to the Secret History by the Nation of Islam, there's a chapter on how the Jews suppressed the Nat Turner Rebellion. And why is this the case? Because they found one Jewish militia captain somewhere in Virginia who was involved in putting down the Nat Turner Rebellion. So he becomes the reason why the Nat Turner Rebellion. I mean, I found it fascinating. When I first read about this, I thought, who'd have thunk that there was a Jewish militia captain in the Virginia militia? But did he put down the Turner Rebellion? Of course not. So what you can do is you can pull out a fact out of nowhere and say, this proves something. The Aaron Lopez situation is particularly interesting because unlike many businessmen, Lopez kept meticulous records. And you can speak to that far better than me. But we know what Lopez is doing because he's got good business records. So if you're a historian and you want to write about the slave trade out of Newport, the place you start with is Lopez because it's the best treasure trove of documents to look at.
And
So,
those records prove that Lopez is mainly involved in species. He sends ships to intercept Spanish ships coming out of Chile and Argentina. He's selling peas. He's selling cedar. He's selling the provisions that the plantation system needs.
yeah, look, the slave trade is not his main business.
Right.
But he isn't like almost all other people in the like most all other whites in the Americas. He accepts slavery and he's involved in the business. Now, not everybody is. There are people who say, I don't get involved in slavery. George Washington owns lots of slaves. There's a Rhode Island connection here, so I'm going to tell a very short story. George Washington is shocked when he takes over the American Army at Cambridge because there are black soldiers in his units. And I got to tell you, for a white Virginia slave owner, there is nothing scarier than black men with bayonets and muskets. And Washington says, who are these people and why are they in their army, my army? And he calls all the New England generals to his tent and says, what's going on here? And they say, well, they're our neighbors. They vote in some of our states. They're fellow citizens and they serve in the militia. Washington is smart enough to say, fine, this is the first indication that he is a great leader. He doesn't fight it. He does go to the Congress and say, could you pass a law stopping any new enlistments of blacks? And then he goes off to war, goes off to battle. And what does he discover? He discovers that black soldiers are just as good as white soldiers. Some of them are cowards, some of them are mediocre soldiers, and some of them are incredible heroes. And what Washington concludes is that he likes these black soldiers. They actually are fighting hard because not only are they fighting for America's freedom, they're fighting for their own freedom and the freedom of their families. By the end of the Revolution, here's the Rhode Island connection, George Washington's favorite unit in the entire Continental Army at Yorktown is the 1st Rhode Island. And the 1st Rhode Island is about 50% black. And of those blacks, probably about 50% of them were slaves when the revolution began, and they became free soldiers in the Continental Army. And now the connection of how you separate from slavery. After the revolution, Washington privately vows to get rid of his own slaves, to free them. And he publicly says in a letter, when somebody says, do you buy slaves? He says, I do not take men to market like cattle. In other words, he has learned not to own slaves and not to sell slaves, not to buy slaves. Instead, he spends the last decade of his life preparing the slaves for freedom, letting them operate their own little farms rather than being plantation slaves. And when he dies, they not only become free, but he gives them land. So that's how you remove yourself from slavery. Some Jews do this, some don't, just like their Christian neighbors.
Okay, well, there are several other questions here about, very briefly, what, are Arab traders involved in the slave trade?
Okay, so there are 2 great slave trades out of Africa. There is the Atlantic slave trade, which brings, as I say, about 12.5 million slaves to the Americas, and a couple 100,000 of them maybe end up in Spain, the Azores, the Canaries, Portugal, Sicily. Okay. And then there's something known as the Indian Ocean slave trade. And the Indian Ocean slave trade is the Arab slave trade. And it is actually larger in terms of numbers from what historians can figure out than the Atlantic slave trade. And before the discovery of the New World, there is a trans-Saharan slave trade in which North African Arabs cross the Sahara, raid sub-Sahara Black African villages and countries, gather slaves, bring them up to the rim of the Mediterranean, where they are enslaved in either North Africa or sold into the Mediterranean islands or sold into the northern rim of the Mediterranean. So the answer is that the Arab world is just as vigorously involved in the slave trade as the European world. And of course, the Arabs are willing to enslave European Christians. But by the way, European Christians are willing to enslave North African Muslims. So there's a reciprocity of evil here going on.
Yeah. We've had a question about, would Isaac Toro have had a slave in his home? The answer is probably yes. We know that Aaron Lopez had slaves in his home, and there's a stone in the little burying ground in Newport of Aaron Lopez's slave. The best place to go for that kind of information is the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. They really are the mothership of information about slavery, free blacks, and all of that. They've been in existence for a good long time, and they have wonderful records. So they're the ones to go for that kind of thing. But household slavery was common, as Paul said.
Let me give you the footnote on that, which is very simple. I would guess that virtually every upper middle class urbanite and many middle class urbanites across America, with the exception probably of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, would have owned slaves in their homes because it is household labor. Furthermore, most merchants would have owned a couple of slaves because somebody has to do the heavy lifting. And it's always easier to have a slave do the heavy lifting than to have to hire somebody to do the heavy lifting.
And let's not make the assumption that because it was household slavery, it was any kinder. It may have been. Duchess Comino, for instance, was in the house of William Ellery Channing, and she was treated well. But there's also evidence of slaves being treated even worse because they were in the household. Domestic violence is domestic violence.
Yeah, yes, and I'm not at all. The distinction I'm making is not about treatment. Right. The distinction I am making is about numbers and investment in slaves. So to give you a good example, Chief Justice John Marshall, who has a substantial house in Richmond, owns between 12 and 18 slaves in Richmond, which is a huge number. Make him a millionaire. But I'm sure he has to entertain a lot. He's the Chief Justice, he's a political figure. So he's invested in 12 to 18 slaves in Richmond. It turns out, and this is in my most recent book, Supreme Injustice, he also owns about 200 slaves in the countryside where he has plantations where he's making money. So if you own those plantations, you have hundreds of slaves, and he's buying and selling people his whole life. But if you only own your house in Providence or Newport or Philadelphia or New York, the number of slaves you're going to own is relatively small because you don't need them. And they are an enormously expensive investment. They cost a lot of money. Yeah. And the treatment will vary from, when you look at the history of slavery, treatment varies from people who are literally treating slaves like beloved family members to people who are sadistic, evil, horrible, brutal people, and most people are in the middle.
Yes, right. Well, I think we're there are many questions, and as we know, this is a subject that haunts us, whether we're Jews or not.
I'm happy to take a couple of more. It depends on whether you have to close this down or whether our very patient audience has disappeared because they're tired of listening to me.
We still have a lot of folks out there, but again, go to what I'm trying to do is get the website address, but just go to turosynagogue.org/Truro Synagogue Foundation/programs and events, and that'll get you to the recording of this. Let's make sure that we, that my email address, Dan Snydacker, all one word, @gmail. And we will try to get all of these questions answered. You talked about whipping, and Rhode Island was founded by Baptists.
Mm-hmm.
And very shortly thereafter, the Quakers came to town. The Baptists didn't particularly like the Quakers, but the Quakers were whipped. The Baptists were whipped in Massachusetts. The Quakers,
Massachusetts didn't like anybody.
No,
unless they were Puritan.
They whipped Quakers, but they also hung Quakers. If you came back again and again, they'd hang you.
There were
your point about beating is well taken.
There were 4 Quakers who were hanged in Boston now, by the way, the Quakers were obnoxiously disruptive.
Right.
And the answer was, well, we hang them.
Yeah, right. I guess there's some very tough questions out there. What prompts a slave owner to free a slave? That's open to every slave owner that frees a slave probably has a different set of reasons.
I can give a quick answer on that. Okay, there is in the American context. First, there's the revolutionary political answer. There are people who say, we have this declaration that says we're all created equal and entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I can't morally own somebody and believe in this. I'm freeing you. There are people during the revolution who go to their male slaves and say, if you're willing to serve in the army, I'll free you. And when you come back, I'll free your family. Okay, so that's a kind of a political response to slavery. There is a religious response. There are people who come back from church on a Sunday and say, I heard the sermon, and if I'm going to do unto others as I think that should be done unto me, I got to free these people. Okay, there are some of those. There
are lots of people. I'm wearing my Oberlin overshirt here. Oberlin College was a source of abolitionist speakers. Lucy Stone, for instance, was one of the first people to hit the Hastings and argue in front of increasingly large crowds about the immorality of slavery. So there was that pressure. There
is that pressure. But the other thing is, there are also many slave owners who free slaves for very personal reasons. They free their children, they free their mistress, they free some slave who has been very, very loyal to them. But the reality is that in the North, when Rhode Island and Connecticut and Pennsylvania and New York passed laws and New Jersey passed laws to end slavery, the slave owners bitterly object to these laws. They're just outvoted.
Right. And there's also stories like in Newport of a slave called Newport Gardner who bought his own freedom, by giving music lessons and by composing music. And this underscores, there've been questions about the racism inherent in slavery, that because the slaves were Black, and there was a growing poison of racism, that was easier to own slaves. And that's true. But there was also just the plain straightforward economic reason. And if your slave could buy his freedom from you, fine. In some cases.
In some cases, but you could also get the unscrupulous slave owner who says, if you go out, if you work every Sunday, because I give you Sunday off, you
Yeah.
work every Sunday and save money and give it to me, I'll free you. And once they get the money, they say, well, thanks for the money, but I always own this because I own you. I think I'll sell you.
Right, right. So there's this huge variety, this huge diversity within the institution of slavery. You know, Newport Jews are culpable. They did own slaves, but as you say, were they culpable because they were Jewish?
No,
or because they were upper middle class?
they are culpable because they live in a society, which is what I tried to say at the beginning of this talk.
Yeah.
They live in a society where everyone assumes. Let me put it in a somewhat different way so people understand. In 1775, when the revolution begins, slavery is legal everywhere in the Western Hemisphere, from Hudson Bay to Tierra del Fuego, from the Arctic Circle to the southern tip of Argentina. There is no place where you cannot buy slaves, and there is no place where the law, the legal system, doesn't support the ownership of slaves and protect you in your right to buy slaves. In 1772, the Chief Justice of England, Lord Mansfield, frees a slave who was brought to England. He says that you cannot bring a slave to England from Virginia because we don't have any laws allowing slavery in England. In the same decision, he says, however, our courts will enforce the contract for the sale of a slave in Jamaica or Virginia. So that if you are a slave trader and bring slaves to Jamaica or Barbados, and there's a dispute over the sale, our courts will enforce the contract. And 15 years later, there is a case in which a slaving vessel owned by a British slave trader is off course, and their slaves are weakening because they're running out of food and water. And so they throw 200 of them overboard. And then, because they make the calculated decision that the insurance claim for half the value of the slaves was better than what they would get from selling these slaves because they were so weak. And when the case initially goes to Lord Mansfield, who is seen as this great icon of liberty because he ends slavery in England, Lord Mansfield says that while it shocks the conscience, this is no different than if they had thrown horses overboard. Ultimately, the insurance company wins and doesn't have to pay because it turns out that they're able to prove to the court that the ship was off course from incompetence, not weather, and that in fact it had rained, so they did have enough water. But the point is this, that in the Anglo-American world that we come out of, or in the Spanish-American world of the time, or the French-American world, or the Portuguese-American world, or the Dutch or the Danish American worlds, because they all have colonies, and Sweden had had some for a while. Slavery is legal, it is accepted, and you could take all the opponents of slavery in the New World and put them in a room, and it would probably fit in the Touro Synagogue, which you said won't hold more than about 200 people.
Less than that, yeah.
There isn't, the revolution is what leads to ultimately undermining slavery. But everybody accepts it. Racism is developed to justify what is happening, and it does a very good job of it.
Yeah. that's the fundamental thing here. Most of the slaves that came to the Americas were Black, and
All of them.
yeah, and
There had been some enslavement of Native Americans, but it is for a variety of reasons, very complicated reasons. Native Americans, enslavement of Native Americans stops either because they die off from European diseases, they run away because they're able to go to find their way to other native populations, or because they're absorbed into the white community. But no, the slaves are all from Africa, and that becomes the defining problem for our hemisphere. And it is a hemisphere-wide problem, and everybody who's here is part of it. What's extraordinary is not that people in the 1750s or 60s owned slaves in the New World. What's extraordinary is that some don't, because that makes them stand out from their neighbors who do.
right, yeah, and this could go, Paul, this could go on indefinitely. Again, I would urge folks to go to the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society and other places, the Rhode Island Historical Society. If you're interested in exploring more of this, there's a, of course, there's a tremendous amount of material online that you can find to answer some of these questions that we haven't been able to address today. But in terms of our understanding the details of Newport's involvement, our understanding of the role of the Jews in Newport in this has been very helpful. This comparative, broad scale perspective. You can't take one little piece of the Atlantic world and study it as if it were unique. It's part of this system, part of this complex relationship between colonies and metropolitan areas, and it doesn't absolve anybody, but it helps us understand it.
If I could end on a somewhat positive note to what is ultimately a grim topic. What is fascinating is that when the Central European Jews come to America in the 1840s and 1850s, coming out of a liberal, enlightened world, they almost universally become supporters of anti-slavery. And they become active in opposing slavery because they come to America thinking that slavery is wrong. And maybe that's what's instructive. The Iberian Jews and the early British Jews came from a world where slavery was okay. And so that is the attitude they brought with them. And the new Jews like Rabbi David Einhorn, or the 4 Civil War generals, or the 2 Jews who become governors after the Civil War, they are coming from a very different world with very different ideas. And as a result of that, they become anti-slavery.
Right. We have a comment from someone that Lord Mansfield is Dido Bell's uncle, and Dido Bell must be somebody that is known here, and the follow-up comment is ironic, and it seems to me that if you're not talking about ironies, you're not really talking about history.
That's right.
Well, Paul, this has just been fabulous. It's been a privilege to sit and converse with someone who has such an encyclopedic knowledge of this subject, who has dedicated his career to this and other things. We'd love to stay in touch with you. I'd love to have you help us move forward.
Look, I want to do it live so we can go out for some good fish.
Yeah.
There's a reason to come to Rhode Island.
Right.
And
well,
it's not just
you got a date.
The Rhode Island Reds.
Yeah, come down after come down after, after March, the end of March, when it finally begins to be habitable here. Come down and we'll maybe do a live talk with you.
I would
And
love it. It would be great
yeah,
fun.
okay. Well, thank you to all of you who stayed with us. I've just copied all of the questions and pasted it into a document. I will do my best over the next day or so to get as many of those answered as I can. I'll forward them to Paul. Send me your additional questions to dansnydacker@gmail.com, and I'll take care of getting those to Paul as well. Paul, thank you very much. We look forward to seeing everyone on January 12th for a really entirely different perspective. Our speaker, Peter Vlerdingerbroek, is one of the most respected architectural historians in the Netherlands, in Utrecht and Amsterdam. And the importance of Amsterdam in shaping the culture of Jews, the culture, the religious practice, and the architecture here can't be understated. So that too will be, I'm sure, a fascinating conversation. Paul, thank you very much. And at this point, I'll say goodnight.
Thank you. It's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you all for participating.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. And thanks to Emily Georgie for being the Zoom administrator. She appears as Zoom admin, and she has been an invaluable help to us as we move forward. So thank you all, and good night.